Hi people, Moin away from back here again as always, and as usual. I simply have something interesting for you guys. You can tell based on the header of this video. An example of a time loop. This is from a YouTube channel, a snippet from a video from a YouTube channel called Dr. Hollow. They're like creepypastas. So essentially scary stories, and regardless of whether they're based on fact, whether they actually happened, or whether they were inspired by true events or not, whether it's just purely made up bullshit, whether it's just fiction, something interesting that I'm going to have you guys listen to. Listen closely to it. After the snippet is done, I'll elaborate.
My dad was stationed in Germany in the 80s in the US Army, and every 10 years or so they would do what's called a winter reforger, which was basically a giant game of war where two sides competed against each other, and my dad happened to be there during one. Him and a buddy operated a tank, but due to some complication, they needed reinforcements, so they had to stay put and wait. They got bored and walked to a small nearby town to get a bottle of apple corn, a type of alcohol. As they walked into town, they saw a young boy riding a bicycle. They stopped him and asked him the nearest place to get a bottle, and he gave them directions. As they were following his directions, they saw a bar with a bunch of people in it. But for some reason the kid didn't mention it, but they went in anyway. As soon as they walked in, everyone stopped doing whatever they were doing and stared at my dad and his buddy, literally everyone, including the waitresses. After about 5 seconds, everyone simultaneously started acting normal again, like nothing ever happened. A little creeped out, they asked to buy a bottle of apple corn. However, they refused to sell one to him, instead giving them both free shots of it. After this, they kept insisting that they sit down to eat. They were passing around giant bowls of food, and everyone would take some from the bowl and pass it to someone else. But my dad didn't want any food. They just wanted to buy a bottle of apple corn, but they kept refusing, only offering shots and food. Finally, they got tired of it and left. As they were walking around looking for somewhere else to get the apple corn, they passed the young boy again and asked him about the bar and why they refused to sell them the apple corn. The boy turns pale and stammers, "You went to that place?" and immediately cycles away as fast as he possibly can. My dad and his buddy look at each other like, "What the fuck?" Curious, they walk back to the bar to check it again. But when they get there, the bar is completely empty and the lights are off. They stare inside through the glass, and the chairs are all upside down on the table with cobwebs everywhere, and the shelves behind the bar are completely empty and not longer stocked with alcohol. And they checked around the whole area to make sure it was the same area, and sure enough, it was the same bar where only minutes before had been crowded with people. They then found another bar and bought some apple corn and quickly got the fuck out of there. To this day, my dad and his buddy swear on it and say it's the creepiest thing they've ever witnessed.
So yeah, that was an interesting story. This thing has occult relevancies. This is an example, like the header of this video says, of a time loop, a spiritual time loop. What happened in this situation is that the guy and his friend, his buddy, that walked into that bar, they essentially entered a spiritual wormhole where they were teleported back to that location specifically. Either that, or they essentially stepped into, again, a time loop, but instead of a wormhole, but instead of specifically laying emphasis on time, it's the spiritual equivalent. They essentially stepped into the astral plane, or let's just say an alternate dimension, um, either the astral plane or an alternate dimension where this is indeed the case. Okay, where the bar still exists and everything else. That's also why the people in the bar immediately looked at these people, because they looked at him and his buddy, because they could tell that these people, quote unquote, are not from here. Um, it's essentially these people, the people in said bar, they're aware of their own existence enough to the point where they realize that, hey, we're essentially in the spirit realm and there is no outsider going to come. So hence it grabbing the attention of everybody. You know, it's like when you go to a secluded location and a location where people rarely see foreigners. People will look at you and they'll openly stare at you brazenly. So yeah, it's one of those three things. So like I said, it could be a time loop. All of them have a cult relevancy or are relevant in an occult manner. It could be a time loop where they essentially went back to when the bar was still operational. It could be essentially stepping into a wormhole that brought them into the astral plane, where the bar is specifically a subdimension or subdirectory of the astral plane, where that bar still exists essentially on the spiritual level, so on the astral plane. Or last but not least, they essentially went again, stepped into a wormhole of some kind, and they went to a different dimension. Okay, where the bar is still fully operational. The mere fact alone that the kid that pointed them in the direction of the bar uh, actually was completely spooked by the situation indicates that the kid is aware of the fact that at a base level the bar is haunted in one some way, shape, or form in the form of weird noises, basic poltergeist activity. All of this is normal. All of this is like completely normal. Um, but of course, these people don't know it. This is quite, relatively speaking, by occult stance, this is quite common because the people that are telling this story, whether it's fiction, whether it's fact or fiction, the people that are telling these stories, it's not a big deal. It's something that, relatively speaking, has happened more than a few times where people essentially find themselves in such a situation. It's kind of like the Bermuda Triangle. Okay, maybe there are stories out there where a pilot flies into the Bermuda Triangle and all of a sudden he finds himself back in colonial times or in the beginning of the 19th century and everybody is dressed differently and blah blah blah, it just goes on. But in that case it would be the very first example I gave, specifically the person being in a time loop. The difference between all of these three is that, listen, with the first one, you're still in a material plane. It's simply you're literally essentially time traveling without wanting that to be the case. You stepped into a wormhole and guess what, you're in a different dimension. With the second one, it's not time travel. You're essentially spiritually stepping into a different, you're stepping into the astral plane, specifically a subdivision of the astral plane where the bar in this question or in this example is still active. And last but not least, what was the third thing that I said again? Is where these people, is where you essentially step into a different dimension. Okay, there is no time traveling or anything else or spiritual activity going on, but you simply stepped in a different dimension, an alternate reality out of infinite realities, as far as I know, which there are present. Like there's a dimension where I'm a woman, where every man watching this is a woman. It just goes on. Okay. Um, but the last example is that you step in such a dimension where the bar is still active. But again, based on everything the way it happened, honestly, hypothetically speaking, my money would be on. Let me see. My money would be on the second one. Okay, they most likely in this story, the people that went into that bar most likely went stepped into the astral plane without them being aware of it. That explains that explains the kid being spooked on the kid on the bicycle being spooked, the kid that pointed him in the direction of the bar, like I said earlier. That explains the people looking at them for a couple of seconds as in him, you know. Otherwise, there would be mention of people being dressed differently in the bar and whatnot. Again, these the spirits in that thingy, the dead people in the astral plane, specifically where that bar is still active and swinging, fully up and running, they could sense that these people were from the material plane and that these people were not dead like them. But it's not something that they fuss too much over. So that's all, guys. Let me know what your thoughts are if you have any, and until next time, bye. Moreno Regenberg signing off.